damn!
As I always say, there's nothing a good space mechanic can't fix. As I always say, class, you're out of this world. As I always say, no guts, no digestion.
Well, as I always say, no chewing, no free tickets.
As I always say, Ralphie, digested is not delivered. As I always say, for every trip there's a roadmap. As I always say, it's better to be in the bus
Whoa!
than to be in something else. As I always say, if the shoe is clean, wear it. As I always say, to find a frog, be a frog. As I always say, look for connections. As I always say, it doesn't have to be delicious to be nutritious. As I always say, Arnold, it never hurts to be prepared. As I always say, when the going gets hungry, the hungry get going. As I always say, make mistakes, make mistakes, make mistakes. It's the best way to learn something. As I always say, not very often is a long way from never. As I always say, when it pours, the desert stores. As I always say, if you can't take the heat, get out of the desert. As I always say, behind every successful sound is a vibration. As I always say, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the oven. As I always say, the more mixed up things are, the better the solution. As I always say, chemistry, it's a piece of cake. And as I always say, where there's physics, there's a field trip. As I always say, those who are book-bound should take a look around. As I always say, Ralphie, never judge a book by its cover. As I always say, if the plant won't come to you, go to the plant. As I always say, let them eat nectar. As I always say, all pollen tubes lead to home. As I always say, time flies when you've got the right equipment. As I always say, the magic is in the gardeners. As I always say, action! As I always say, when visiting a nest, smell like the rest. As I always say, action. As I always say, it's easy if you've got talent. As I always say, keep an open mind, and you never know who will walk in. As I always say, take chances, make mistakes. As I always say, shooka, kaboom! As I always say, get out there and explore!
Well, in the famous words of Miss Frizzle, the early bird gets the island!
In the immortal words of our very own Ralphie, you can't hit a home run unless you swing the bat. As I always say, unlike the earth, some things never change. As I always say, wahoo! As I always say, to be a bat is to love a bat. As I always say, if they can't see you, they can't eat you. As I always say, when you're a butterfly, do as the butterflies do. As I always say, there's no surprise like butterflies. As I always say, Arnold, a little water never hurt anyone. As someone once said, clouds are the playful fancies of the mighty wind. In the words of my great-aunt Matilda, no! As I always say, to appreciate the water cycle, you've got to have a good sense of humid.
In the famous words of Miss Frizzle, time waits for no vegetable.
As I always say, one tough question deserves another. As Sherlock Gherkin once said, cucumber thieves always return to the scene of the brine. As my great-aunt Chameleon used to say, there's nothing as constant as change. Well, as my great-uncle Barnard used to say, cucumbers come and cucumbers go, but pickles go on forever. As Christopher Columbus said when he set sail to look for America, all aboard for parts unknown. As my great-aunt Janine used to say, a good engine is worth the price of ignition. As my grandmother Frida used to say, a bird on the branch is worth two on the ranch. As I always say, sometimes you have to do the wrong stuff to find out what the right stuff really is. As I always say, where there's a will, there's a windmill.
As the Frizz would say, it never hurts to be prepared. As the Frizz would say, it's time to take chances, get messy, and where is Miss Frizzle anyway?
Well, as I always say, there's nothing like starting out the day with a bang, which reminds me of what my old astronomy teacher used to say. Starlight, star bright, there's always a way to find out if you're right. As Captain Cook once said, the path to success leads in many different directions. In the immortal words of my cousin Bob, it better. I think my great Aunt Penny said it best. A lost ball can go a long way. As I always say, if you can't beat 'em, join 'em. I recall my great Aunt Beatrice once said, you know, one good reptile deserves another. As I always say, what's good for an alligator is good for a bussigator.
As Miss Frizzle said, nothing makes a herp as happy as when the temperature's just right.
Oh, as my Uncle Wilbur used to say,
Oh, you can lead a bus to water, but you can't make it sink.
as my Uncle Vern always said,
Arr! There's more than one way to sink a floater!
as my old Uncle Windchill used to say,
Air today, gone tomorrow.
well, Jerry, as you yourself once said, the truth always floats to the surface.